The airfield at Leiston woke slowly under a sky the colour of steel. England in winter had a way of pressing its weight into everything. The dampness in the soil, the bite in the wind, the distant thrum of engines that never truly went silent. Rows of P-47 Thunderbolts sat under canvas tarps, their bellies streaked with oil and cold rain. Men moved among them like ghosts in heavy coats, smoking, swearing softly, carrying the quiet exhaustion of those who had seen too many mornings start exactly the same way. They all knew that every day's calm was a fragile lie. Somewhere across the channel, the Luftwaffe waited. That morning, something different broke the monotony. The first P-51 Mustang rolled in from the horizon, its polished fuselage gleaming silver through the mist. The sound it made was sharper, cleaner, more confident, a predator's hum. Mechanics stopped what they were doing. Ground crews lifted their eyes. The pilots, who'd learned to distrust anything called new, fell silent. It looked unlike anything they'd seen before, sleeker than the rugged P-47, longer in the nose, graceful yet dangerous in the way it carried itself. It didn't look like a machine meant for men. It looked like something meant for the sky alone. At its controls was a man named Captain Billy Larkin, a transfer from another group, and a problem from the moment his boots touched English mud. He was tall, sunburned, and carried himself like he was still flying over Texas ranchland instead of enemy territory. He laughed too loud, challenged too much, drank too freely, and believed himself invincible. The men around him had seen plenty like him before, young, fast, and dead within a month. But Larkin had something most of them had lost, an unshakable belief that courage wasn't foolishness. That belief, dangerous as it was, would change everything. The Mustang had been whispered about for months, but even the officers were cautious. It was fast, yes, but untested in the kind of brutal turning fights that decided who went home and who burned in a field of wreckage. The engineers said it could handle altitude and range. They didn't say what would happen if you pushed it beyond what the manuals allowed. Larkin, of course, didn't care about manuals. The men around the flight line saw him walking toward the new fighter with that reckless smile and knew something foolish was coming. He strapped in before anyone gave him clearance, waving off the ground crew like they were bothersome flies. The canopy sealed with a sharp metallic click. The propeller blurred into life, and the Mustang's engine, an unholy marriage of British design and American hunger, roared across the airfield. It was a sound that made men stop breathing for half a second. Larkin taxied to the runway, gunned the throttle, and the plane leapt forward, wheels kicking up spray before slicing cleanly into the grey sky. What happened next would become legend, though at that moment it was nothing more than madness. The Mustang climbed higher, higher still, until it was a sliver above the clouds. The onlookers thought he'd simply test her reach, maybe circle back for a gentle landing. Instead, without warning, the fighter tilted, rolled, and dove into a full barrel roll so violent it made mechanics shout in disbelief. The Silverbird twisted over itself, wings flexing under the strain, gravity clawing at its frame. It should have torn apart. Every manual, every test, every cautious officer said it would, but it didn't. The Mustang came out of the roll perfectly balanced, nose level, wings true. For a moment, even the wind seemed to pause. Larkin held steady, throttled up, and climbed again, this time faster, harder, pushing the limits as though he were taunting the sky to break him. When he landed, the airfield was silent except for the ticking of cooling metal. Officers stormed toward him, furious, but there was no hiding the truth. The plane hadn't failed, it had thrived. That reckless maneuver proved something no test pilot or engineer had dared to try. The P-51 could twist under pressure and recover without breaking. It could roll, dive, and snap back in ways that made the German fighters, once feared for their agility, suddenly vulnerable. Within weeks, the discovery spread quietly among pilots across Europe. In smoky mess halls and cold hangars, men whispered about Larkin's role, though official reports never used the name. The higher-ups called it a dangerous misapplication of procedure. The men who flew called it survival. Soon, squadrons began experimenting. They rolled through cloud banks to shake pursuing Focke-Wulfs. They twisted out of head-on attacks, spun out of dives, reappeared behind their enemies, with the Mustang's guns already aligned. The Luftwaffe, once so confident, began losing its edge. German pilots reported unpredictable American maneuvers that made their own aircraft seem sluggish. The P-51's legend was born not in a briefing room, but in one reckless moment of instinct, a barrel roll that shouldn't have worked. After that, Captain Larkin was both admired and despised. He was reprimanded for insubordination during flight testing, but the reprimand was quietly buried under layers of paperwork. The truth was that no one could deny what he'd proven. The Mustang wasn't just another fighter, it was something alive, something that could be pushed, challenged, even angered, and still come back sharp and ready for more. It turned the tide of air war, not through strategy, but through discovery. And that discovery had started with arrogance, defiance, and one man's refusal to believe in limits. As the days turned to months, the P-51 became the shadow over Germany. Its range carried it deep beyond what the Luftwaffe could cover. Its maneuverability gave it an edge in every dogfight. But none of that was in the air that first morning at Leiston. Only the quiet awe of men watching a silver plane survive a role that should have been suicide. For years afterward, when veterans spoke of it, they said that was the moment the war began to turn. Not in a strategy meeting, not in a factory, but right there, on a damp English morning, when one stupid barrel roll turned a machine into legend. By the spring of 1944, the air war over Europe had turned into a storm that never seemed to end. The sky was no longer a place of wonder, but a graveyard suspended in motion, filled with smoke trail, burning wings, and parachutes that drifted down like broken feathers. The P-51 Mustang had become the weapon of choice, sleek and unstoppable, a machine that now carried the weight of Allied hope on its silver back. But every man who climbed into one knew that no amount of beauty could disguise what it was built to do. Captain Billy Larkin had become the embodiment of that contradiction, the daring fool who'd found genius in recklessness. His once bright grin had hardened into something sharper, and though he still carried himself with the swagger of a man who thought he couldn't die, there was something different behind his eyes. The laughter that once filled the hangars had been replaced by silence and short, clipped words, as the war carved its lessons into him the only way it knew how, one mission at a time. Each sortie began the same way, engines warming in the cold dawn, ground crews working with trembling hands, pilots sitting in their cockpits with cigarettes burning down between their fingers. The 8th Air Force had learned to move like clockwork, each man playing his part in the great machine of destruction that stretched from London to Berlin. The Mustang's long legs meant that bomber crews could now fly deeper into the Reich, hammering factories, railways, and cities that had once been untouchable. But that reach came at a cost. The further they went, the thinner the air became, the lonelier the sky, and the more men failed to return. Each night, the mess hall grew quieter, faces disappearing one by one, until only a few old jokes and empty chairs remained. Larkin kept flying, always volunteering, always pushing the Mustang further than it was meant to go. Some said he had a death wish. Others said he just couldn't stand the idea of anyone else doing his job better. Maybe both were true. The Luftwaffe had begun to fear the silhouette of the Mustang. German pilots who once mocked the Americans now prayed not to see those twin white stripes on a silver fuselage. They called it the ghost with the blue nose. The 109s and 190s that once ruled the air found themselves hunted, forced into desperate dives and blind retreats. The Mustang was faster, climbed higher, and could twist out of sight before a German could even line up a shot. The Larkin roll, once dismissed as a stunt, had become standard practice across squadron. Pilots used it to break out of dogfights, to slip past enemy fire, to reverse positions in a heartbeat. It wasn't just a trick anymore, it was survival written into instinct. Yet even as it saved lives, the maneuver took its toll. Planes returned riddled with holes, pilots with trembling hands, engines coughing smoke from the strain. The Mustang was unforgiving to the careless. One mistake, and the sky would swallow you. On March 6, 1944, Larkin led an escort mission over Berlin, one of the first deep penetration raids into the heart of Germany. The bombers stretched across the horizon like a moving city, hundreds of them, their contrails weaving white scars through the frozen blue. Below, the world burned, flak towers opened up, black explosions blooming all around them, shaking the air with concussions that made the Mustangs buck and shudder. The radio crackled with clipped orders, half screams and static. Then the fighters came, dozens of Messerschmitts diving from the sun, fast and merciless. The sky turned into chaos, machine guns tearing through clouds, tracers arcing like fiery rain. Larkin rolled his Mustang hard, pulling into the fight, the G-forces crushing his chest as he swung in behind a 190. His burst tore the German apart in a flash of fire and fragments, but even as he leveled out, two more dropped onto his tail. He threw the Mustang into a dive so steep it felt suicidal, pulling the roll again at the last second, twisting through smoke and wreckage, reappearing behind them. In that instant, it wasn't luck or skill. It was instinct, pure and feral. The stupid move had become his signature, and it saved his life again. When the formation returned to Leiston that evening, the runway was lined with burning wrecks and medics waiting with stretchers. Out of 24 Mustangs, only 16 made it back. Larkins was one of them, pocked with bullet holes, the left wing patched with smoke. He climbed out without a word, hands shaking, eyes hollow. The ground crew cheered, but he barely heard them. Something inside him had shifted. War wasn't a proving ground anymore. It was a debt he couldn't stop paying. He'd survived again, but the price was written in the empty bunks around him, in the faces that would never smile again. From that day on, he flew quieter. No more boasting, no more reckless grins, just long silences and a constant stare toward the hangars, as if counting ghosts. But his legend grew. Younger pilots idolized, copying his every movement, painting their Mustangs silver like his. The brass turned his name into a symbol for morale. The newspapers back home printing stories of Larkin's luck, the miracle pilot who could outfly death itself. He hated it because he knew the truth. Death wasn't something you outflew. You just postponed it, traded minutes for miles, breaths for bullets, and someday it would catch up. Still, he kept going, not because of pride anymore, but because the war had become his gravity. The sky was the only place where he still felt human. Up there, surrounded by the roar of engines and the smell of cordite, everything made sense again. Down on the ground, it was too quiet, too real. The laughter that once filled the barracks was gone, replaced by the sound of letters being folded and read under flickering lamps. Each one began the same way. "We regret to inform you," and each time he felt the same weight pressing on his chest. But when dawn came, he was back in the cockpit, pulling the canopy shut, the world narrowing again to a horizon filled with cloud and fire. If you've made it this far into the story, take a second, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The war's about to change again, and it won't be kind to anyone who stays behind. By the summer of 1944, Europe was burning from the inside out. The Allies were advancing on the ground, pushing through hedgerows and villages, but in the sky, the real war still raged every single day. The Luftwaffe refused to die quietly, throwing every last ounce of desperation into the clouds above France and Germany. The P-51 Mustang had become both sword and shield, the angel of vengeance that roamed above the crumbling Reich. And at the center of it all, Captain Billy Larkin kept flying, his once famous grin now replaced by the hard, silent stare of a man who had outlived too many friends. The airfields had changed, the faces around him had changed, even the war itself had changed. But one thing remained constant. The sky demanded everything. It demanded courage, precision, and sometimes the last piece of a man's soul. The missions had grown bloodier since D-Day. Each sortie stretched farther, deeper into the continent, where the enemy no longer fought for victory, but for pride and revenge. Pilots faced swarms of German fighters backed by ground guns that turned the air into a black, roaring storm. The Mustang could take the punishment, but the men inside it couldn't always. The role that had once saved Larkin's life had become instinct for every pilot under his command. They performed it without thinking, like a heartbeat, emotion learned not from manuals, but from the desperate choreography of survival. The maneuver had already been passed down through entire squadrons. Larkin's role, whispered like prayer before takeoff, half superstition, half science. But even prayers couldn't stop fate. On July 18, 1944, they took off from Leiston under a pale, washed-out sky. The mission was a long-range escort to Munich. Bombers packed tight with payloads meant to cripple what was left of German industry. 24 Mustangs were assigned to guard them. Larkin led from the front, as always, the sunlight cutting across the blue nose of his fighter like a blade. The takeoff was smooth, the formation steady, engines singing in harmony. At 30,000 feet, the bombers began their run. Below them, Germany stretched wide and grey, pocked with craters and the smoking bones of cities. And then the radio erupted. "Bandits! 12 o'clock high!" They came out of the sun, dozens of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, charging straight through the bombers' defensive fire. The sky split open. The calm hum of engines turned into chaos, into thunder. Tracers zipped past canopies. Bombers broke formation, burning, dropping their payloads early just to stay alive. Larkin didn't hesitate. He yanked the Mustang into a climb, looped over, and dove straight into the heart of it. His guns flashed, tearing through a 190 in a burst of sparks and flame. He rolled right, narrowly missing debris from his own kill, and caught another enemy cutting across the formation. The dogfight stretched across miles of sky, twisting, spinning, disappearing into cloud and smoke. One of Larkin's wingmen, Lieutenant Hartley, took a hit to the right wing. The plane began to roll, smoke pouring out. Larkin dove after him, calling over the radio, voice steady but cold. "Bail out, Hart! Get out now!" No response, just static. Then, through the haze, Larkin saw the cockpit canopy jettison. A parachute bloomed, drifting slowly toward the black-spotted ground below. For one fleeting second, relief cut through the noise, but then a burst of flak bloomed beneath the chute, swallowing it in flame. Larkin looked away. There was nothing left to see. He turned back into the fight, eyes hard, face pale. Every round he fired seemed to burn a little more of his humanity away. He used the roll again, diving into a near vertical descent to shake a Messerschmitt off his tail. The maneuver had become second nature, but this time it pushed the Mustang past her limits. The wings groaned, the frame shuddered, the G-forces pressed his vision into darkness. At the last second, he pulled up, the aircraft screaming as it leveled out. Below him, two German fighters collided mid-air in a blaze of wreckage. When he climbed back to altitude, he could barely breathe. The air felt thick, metallic, filled with the ghosts of men who'd vanished seconds before. By the end of that day, only 13 Mustangs made it back to Leiston. The hangars were quiet again, the air thick with the smell of burned fuel and metal. Mechanics worked without speaking. The surviving pilots sat on the ground, too drained to move. Larkin's Mustang bore fresh scars, bullet holes peppered across the fuselage, a section of wing held together with luck and faith. When he climbed down, he didn't speak. He just stood there, looking at the horizon, where the clouds had turned orange in the dying light. Someone called his name, but he didn't answer. He didn't even seem to hear. That night, the officers gathered for debriefing. Maps were unrolled, reports read aloud, voices droning about numbers, tonnage, losses, and projected enemy damage. Larkin sat apart, staring at his gloved hands, black with oil and gunpowder. None of it mattered. The statistics, the victory claims, the commendations, they were all just noise. What mattered were the names missing from the roster, the bunks that would be empty in the morning, the letters that would be written before dawn. He left before the meeting ended, stepping out into the cool night air. Above him, the stars were sharp and cold, the same stars he'd seen 100 times before, the same stars shining over the men who'd fallen. He lit a cigarette with trembling hands, the flame flickering in the wind. In that moment, it was clear that whatever had driven him once, pride, defiance, survival, was being replaced by something else. Not peace, not fear, but a kind of surrender to the inevitability of it all. He knew he would keep flying. He knew he would keep rolling that plane through impossible dives because the sky no longer frightened him. What frightened him was the ground, and what waited when the engines finally stopped. The war had made him a legend, but legends, he realized, were just stories told by those who survived. And in war, surviving didn't always mean living. Now tell me, have you ever pushed yourself past the point of no return just to prove you could survive? Comment below with "I've felt that" if you understand what he carried. Under the dim light of late 1944, Europe was collapsing piece by piece, and yet the airfields of England still hummed like restless hives, churning out men and machines into the endless storm. The P-51 squadrons had become something close to myth, sweeping across skies once ruled by the Luftwaffe, now broken and desperate. The Germans were fighting like cornered wolves, their numbers dwindling, but their ferocity growing sharper by the day. The air was no longer a place of dominance, but of ghosts. Every mission took something from those who returned, and Billy Larkin had almost nothing left to give. His face had grown thinner, his eyes darker, his voice quieter. The war had drained the noise from him. He flew because not flying felt worse. December came with a bitter cold that froze oil in the lines and turned men's hands numb before they could finish tightening a bolt. The hangars smelled of frost and fear, of metal and coffee gone stale. The men worked with quiet urgency, talking less each day, as if words themselves had become a luxury. The Allies had reached the German border, and Berlin was finally within reach. But for every mile gained on the ground, the sky seemed to demand another dozen lives. Each flight was an offering to some invisible god of war that never seemed satisfied. Larkin knew it too well. He'd seen enough parachutes fail to open, enough pilots vanish into smoke, enough letters folded and placed on bunks that would never be used again. On the morning of the 24th, he was ordered to lead a strike over the Ardennes. Intelligence said it would be light resistance, just a sweep, nothing serious. It was never nothing serious. The Battle of the Bulge had erupted without warning, and the Luftwaffe had thrown everything it had left into the frozen air. As the Mustangs took off, frost still clinging to their wings, the world below was buried under snow and fire. The engines screamed into the grey dawn, the air biting like knives against glass canopies. Each pilot could feel it in his gut. Something was wrong. At 15,000 feet, the first radar warnings came through. Dozens of German fighters were climbing fast, converging from the east. Within minutes, the sky was alive with chaos. Focke-Wulfs streaked through the clouds, spitting tracer fire. Bombers broke formation, their engines burning bright orange. Larkin barked orders through the radio, his voice calm, clipped, mechanical. The Mustang moved as if it were part of him. Every turn, every roll, an instinct born of endless repetition. He dove through a cloud bank and came out behind a 109, his guns tearing it apart in seconds. Another closed in from below, cannon shells raking his fuselage. He felt the impact shudder through the controls, saw a thin line of smoke trailing behind him, but he didn't break. He rolled again. His roll. Tight. Fast. Impossible. The enemy overshot, and in one breath, Larkin swung behind and fired. The 109 vanished in a blossom of flame, but there was no time to celebrate. The sky was filled with screams and static. He could hear his men calling out, Hartley's replacement, young Mason, shouting for help before his signal went dead, Jenkins reporting engine failure, then silence. The battle stretched into eternity, a frozen ballet of smoke and speed. Larkin's Mustang twisted through it all, the silver wings flashing against the snow clouds like lightning. He didn't think anymore. He moved on pure reflex, chasing shapes, firing, rolling, diving, climbing. The G-forces crushed his ribs, the blood drained from his vision, but he refused to let go. Then, through the haze, he saw them, a squadron of German bombers breaking west, trying to escape toward the forest. He knew he should regroup, but something in him snapped. He pushed the throttle forward, alone, diving after them. The world narrowed into the hunt. His guns flared, shredding one, then another. The last bomber's tail gunner fired wildly, rounds punching through his canopy, slicing across his arm. He barely felt it. His vision was tunneling, red at the edges, his breath ragged. He pulled up into the roll again, trying to shake a 190 closing in behind him. The Mustang screamed in protest, the metal vibrating like it was about to tear apart. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The wind, the engine, his pulse. Then, the 190 exploded behind him, caught in his line of fire as he came out of the roll. He had done it again. When he limped back to base that afternoon, the airfield was half empty. The snow had turned grey with soot, the sky orange with the last light of day. Only 8 Mustangs returned. The medics pulled him from the cockpit, his flight suit soaked with blood and frost. He didn't speak a word. The other men just watched in silence as they carried him toward the infirmary. The legend of Billy Larkin, the man who could make the sky bend, was still alive, but as the stretcher disappeared behind the tent flaps, even the most hardened pilots turned away. They had seen what it took to be that kind of legend, and they wanted no part of it. That night, the snow kept falling. The mechanics worked under dim lamps, repairing wings that might never fly again. Someone left a cup of coffee on Larkin's wing, steam curling into the cold air. Inside the infirmary, he stared at the ceiling, hearing the faint rumble of distant engines, and for the first time in months, he didn't want to go back up. He wasn't afraid, he was just tired. The sky, once his sanctuary, had become a place filled only with ghosts. Do you know that feeling? The moment you realize the thing that once saved you is the same thing that's slowly killing you. If you do, write, "I know that feeling," in the comments. Winter dragged itself into 1945, like an old animal refusing to die. The war was nearing its end, but no one on the front, or in the air, dared to believe it. The Germans were still fighting with a kind of madness, their desperation turning every sky into a trap. The Allies had the numbers, the machines, the momentum, yet every pilot who climbed into a Mustang still felt the same cold weight settle in his chest before takeoff. For Captain Billy Larkin, that weight had become familiar, almost comforting. It was the only constant left. The pain in his arm from the bullet wound hadn't fully healed, but he was back in the cockpit, ignoring the doctor's orders, and the look of worry in the crew chief's eyes. Men like him didn't rest. They just ran out of missions. The Mustang sat ready, silver paint dull under the frost, wings scarred and patched from too many battles. The ground crew worked in silence, moving around Larkin with quiet reverence, as if tending to a ghost they were afraid might vanish if spoken to. His reputation had become something larger than life, even among those who didn't know the full story. To the younger pilots, he was a symbol of survival, a man who had stared into the heart of chaos and returned with a grin. They didn't see the cracks, the tremor in his hands when he lit a cigarette, the way he sometimes stared into the distance as if listening to voices carried by the wind. They just saw the legend. By January, Berlin was cornered. The Luftwaffe had been reduced to fragments, its veterans dead or captured, its new recruits barely trained. But the danger hadn't faded. It had become more unpredictable. Jet fighters had begun to appear, Me-262s, sleek and terrifying, faster than anything the Allies could match in straight flight. The first time Larkin saw one, it tore through his formation like lightning, a streak of grey that vanished before a single gun could. It was like watching the future arrive in the middle of a nightmare. But even the future couldn't save Germany now. Fuel was running out, pilots were being pulled from the ground at random, and the P-51s ruled the sky like patient executioners. On the 14th, Larkin's squadron was ordered on a deep escort to Dresden. Rumours whispered that the Germans were preparing one last desperate counterattack. The mission brief was simple: protect the bombers, neutralise any resistance, and get home alive. Simple words that never matched the reality. They took off at dawn, the air freezing, the horizon a smear of orange and ash. 20 Mustangs, their engines singing the same grim hymn. The formation climbed higher and higher until the ground below disappeared into a white ocean of cloud. From above, the world looked peaceful. From below, it was a furnace. Somewhere over Leipzig, they met the resistance, a mix of 190s and a few of those new jets, tearing through the formation like wolves through a herd. Larkin's instincts kicked in. He rolled hard, cut through the chaos, and locked onto a 190 that was climbing toward the bombers. His guns lit up, the German fighter bursting apart in mid-air. Then a jet screamed past his canopy, close enough for him to see the pilot's face. It was gone in a heartbeat, leaving nothing but the thunder of its engines. Larkin dove after it, pushing the Mustang beyond its comfort, knowing he couldn't catch it, but refusing to let it go. The Mustang trembled, the wings howling in protest, but he held the chase until the jet leveled off and turned back for home. He didn't shoot it down, but he'd forced it away from the bombers. That was enough. By the time the squadron regrouped, 6 Mustangs were missing. The air was filled with smoke and debris, voices shouting through the static of the radio. When they finally crossed back over friendly lines, the silence was heavier than the noise had been. Back at base, no one spoke. During debriefing, Larkin sat at the edge of the room, staring at his hands. The adrenaline had drained away, leaving only exhaustion. He thought of the men who'd flown beside him that morning: Mason, Reed, Ellis, all gone in the same sky they'd once ruled. Their bunks would be stripped before morning, their letters boxed and sent away. That night, he walked out to the runway alone. The air was clear, the moon hanging low over the silent plains. He ran his fingers along the Mustang's wing, feeling every dent, every scar, like the lines of an old friend's face. The war was ending. Everyone could feel it. But for men like him, the end didn't feel like peace. It felt like being erased. What would happen when the noise stopped, when the sky no longer needed him? The thought frightened him more than any dogfight ever had. He lit a cigarette, the glow reflecting in his tired eyes. Somewhere in the distance, an engine coughed to life, then died again. The world was quiet, almost too quiet. He thought of all the men who'd never made it this far, their laughter, their arrogance, their stupid, reckless courage. Maybe, he thought, survival wasn't about being lucky or skilled. Maybe it was just about being too stubborn to quit. The smoke curled up into the darkness, vanishing into the stars. He didn't know it yet, but the next mission would be his last. Now, tell me, do you ever wonder what you'd become if the thing that defined you suddenly disappeared? Right, I've thought about that below, if you know that feeling. March of 1945 came with an eerie silence, the kind that made veterans uneasy, because quiet skies rarely meant peace. The war in Europe was dying, yes, but it was not done killing. The bombers still flew daily, the flak still blossomed black above the cities, and the men who flew the Mustangs knew that one mistake, even in the war's final weeks, could erase them from history just as easily as in '43. Captain Billy Larkin was still flying, though no one could quite explain why. He had nothing left to prove. His name had already found its way into newspapers. his photograph clipped to recruitment posters. But those who knew him saw what the papers never did: the hollow behind his eyes, the tremor in his hands when the noise stopped. He was a man who had built his entire soul in the sky, and the sky was almost done needing him. By then, the 357th Fighter Group had been stationed near Belgium, launching final escort runs and strafing columns of retreating German armor. The war on the ground was collapsing, roads clogged with soldiers and refugees, trains stopped dead where tracks had been bombed apart, smoke rising from cities that had been burning for months. Each mission blurred into the next. The targets changed, but the smell of burned oil and metal never did. For the pilots, the routine was mechanical: wake, brief, fly, kill, land, write the report, drink, and try to sleep without dreaming. Larkin followed it like a ritual. He barely spoke anymore. The swagger that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something cold and precise. He wasn't reckless now. He was efficient, deadly efficient. On the morning of March 21st, the air was clear, a pale blue sky, the kind of day that once would have felt peaceful. It wasn't. The mission was a sweep over northern Germany, a clean-up run against retreating convoys and airfields. It sounded easy. It never was. Larkin led 12 Mustangs into the air, the sunlight catching their wings like a dozen silver knives. Below them, the countryside stretched endless and broken, fields scarred with craters, forests black with smoke. They crossed into enemy territory, with barely a word on the radio. The Luftwaffe was supposed to be finished, but war rarely follows schedules. Half an hour into the flight, the warning came. Bandits, low and fast, coming from the east. At first, Larkin didn't see them. Then the glint of sunlight betrayed them. Me-262 jets, maybe half a dozen, slicing through the air at terrifying speed. The squadron tightened formation. The Mustangs were slower, but more agile, their only chance to turn inside the jets before they could strike. The first pass was devastating. 2 Mustangs gone in a heartbeat, torn apart before they could even fire. Larkin banked hard, the air compressing around him, his heart pounding in his ears. He caught one of the 262s as it climbed through a turn, firing a perfect burst that shattered its right engine. The jet spun out in a spiral of smoke, crashing into the forest below. Another dove straight at him, cannons blazing, forcing him into a violent roll that pushed his body against the seat until his vision bled grey. The move saved him. Again, the same stupid, miraculous roll that had made him a legend. The dogfight raged for less than 10 minutes, though it felt like an eternity. When it was over, the sky was empty. 4 Mustangs gone, 3 damaged, 1 jet confirmed down. The radio crackled with silence. Larkin leveled out, breathing hard, the horizon blurring from exhaustion. His fuel was low, but he wasn't ready to turn back. Something in him resisted the idea of landing, of stopping. He climbed higher, into thin, empty air, the kind that pressed against your lungs and made the engine sound distant, hollow. Below him, the war burned on. Small flashes of light where cities used to be. The radio called for him to return. He didn't answer. Maybe he didn't hear, or maybe he just didn't want to. He kept flying, tracing the edges of the clouds, the world fading into white. For a moment, it felt almost peaceful, like those early days in England when the Mustang had been new and hope still seemed possible. He thought of the men who'd flown beside him, the laughter, the arrogance, the terrible beauty of it all. He thought of how something so stupid, so reckless as a single barrel roll, had changed everything. It had saved lives, turned the tide of the air war, maybe even helped end it. But it had also taken pieces of every man who learned it, each twist and turn, scraping away another layer of who they'd been before. When he finally descended, the airfield came into view like a memory. Grey tents, muddy runways, smoke curling from barrels. He landed gently, the wheels touching down with a whisper instead of a roar. The crew ran toward him, relief written across their faces. He didn't smile. He climbed out, handed off his helmet, and stood for a long moment beside the Mustang. Then, for the first time in the war, he turned his back on it and walked away. No ceremony, no word, just silence. That night, the others celebrated. Word had come down. Berlin would fall soon, and the war in Europe would be over within weeks. Larkin sat apart from the noise, staring into the fire. The faces around him were new, too young to understand that victory and loss often wore the same uniform. Someone poured him a drink, and he accepted it without looking up. The crackle of the fire sounded too much like gunfire, and the warmth on his skin reminded him of something burning. He didn't sleep that night. He just watched the flames die one by one, until all that was left was smoke. Tell me something. Do you think peace feels empty after you've lived too long in chaos? Write yes in the comments if you've ever wondered what it's like to survive when the fight is finally over. April bled into May, and the war's end finally came, not with a roar, but with a whimper. The guns went quiet, the skies cleared, and the men who had spent years living minute to minute, heartbeat to heartbeat, suddenly found themselves surrounded by silence that felt heavier than flak. Across Europe, airfields filled with pilots who didn't quite know what to do with their hands anymore. They cleaned their planes, played cards, wrote letters that didn't say what they meant, and they waited. Some waited for orders to go home. Others waited for a reason to stay. Billy Larkin didn't wait for anything. The moment Berlin fell, he simply stopped flying. His Mustang still sat on the line, polished and ready, its nose gleaming blue under the spring sun. The crew chief kept it that way, even though everyone knew Larkin would never take it up again. To touch that machine now felt like touching a grave. The war had taken too much from him. Too many friends, too many fragments of himself scattered over enemy fields and under quiet European skies. He'd given the air everything he had, and in return, it had made him a name and a ghost at the same time. The man who had once been reckless, laughing, indestructible, was gone. What remained was a figure who moved slowly, spoke little, and looked at the sky with something that wasn't fear or love, but a kind of wary recognition, as if seeing an old enemy who'd once been a friend. When the orders came for repatriation, the base erupted in celebration. Men shouted, hugged, threw caps into the air. Larkin just stood at the edge of the runway, cigarette burning between his fingers, watching the planes come and go. The noise of engines had been his heartbeat for years, and now it was about to stop. He thought he'd feel relief, but all he felt was emptiness. The silence didn't bring peace, it brought memory. Every mission played behind his eyes like an old film reel. Hartley spinning down in flames, Mason's laugh before takeoff, the flash of sunlight on the wings of a German jet seconds before it disintegrated. They came in fragments, too many and too fast. He dropped the cigarette, crushed it under his boot, and turned away. The voyage home was strange. The ship was crowded with men who couldn't sleep, who stared at the sea like they were trying to find something familiar in it. They joked, played cards and drank, but underneath it all there was a tension no one could name. They were going home, yes, but who exactly was going home? The boys who had left were gone. What returned were men who had lived a lifetime in a few years, carrying invisible weight in their eyes. Larkin barely spoke the entire trip. He sat on deck most nights, staring at the horizon. When the coastline of America finally appeared, the cheers around him sounded distant, hollow, like echoes from another life. Back in Texas, the heat hit him like a wall. The fields were green again, the air smelled of dust and sun, and the sky was the same endless blue he remembered as a kid. But it didn't feel the same. It felt smaller. The silence that had once been comforting now felt unbearable. Neighbors called him a hero. Newspapers wanted his story, but he turned them all away. They wanted tales of glory, of adventure, of courage. He didn't have those. What he had were flashes of noise and color, the taste of fear in his mouth, the feel of the Mustang stick under his hand, the sound of his wingmen's laughter, before it vanished forever. He tried to fly again. For a few months he took a job testing civilian aircraft for a company out west. But it wasn't the same. The planes were slower, gentler, tamed. They didn't fight him. They didn't need him. He missed the sound of the Merlin engine, the vibration that ran through his bones, the feeling of gravity twisting against his body as he rolled through the air. Yet when he closed his eyes, all he saw were the faces of those who never came down. Flying had once been freedom. Now it was guilt painted across the sky. Eventually he stopped flying altogether. He bought a small house on the edge of town, surrounded by open land where no one bothered him. Some nights, when the wind was right, he could hear the faint hum of a plane far off in the distance, and it made his chest ache. He'd walk outside, look up, and watch until the sound faded. Sometimes he'd imagine it was one of his own, Hartley, Mason, Jenkins, still up there, running practice rolls through the clouds, laughing into the radio. Other nights, he'd just sit on the porch and wait for the memories to pass. They never really did. The world moved on. The Mustangs were retired, the bases dismantled. The war turned into stories told by men with grey hair and grandchildren who couldn't imagine what it meant. But in every museum, in every faded photograph, in every whisper of old airmen talking over whiskey, Billy Larkin's name remained. The fool who rolled a brand new fighter just to see what it could take. The man whose stupid maneuver had given the Allies an edge they didn't even know they had. The one who turned chaos into survival, instinct into legend. And maybe that was enough. Not the medals, not the glory, but the quiet truth that sometimes history changes, not because of orders or plans, but because one man decides to trust the impossible. Somewhere, in that moment above England years ago, when the Mustang twisted through the clouds and came out whole, something eternal had been born. If you've carried something from your past that never really let you go, hit like and subscribe. Maybe the sky doesn't forget, but neither do we.